I do think we are now beginning to have the possibility of a truly integrated gender conversation, that's intersectional, that it also includes the spiritual component. And we are being asked to live responsibly in the psychosocial, racial, political universe without leaving out the spiritual and without using the spiritual to bypass the obligations and challenges of the other realms.
Hello, wonderful people. Happy New Year. I'm Amisha, and this is episode 8 of the Future is Beautiful podcast. I'm starting 2018 not with resolutions, but with allowing myself to enjoy where I am. It feels very freeing, and from this place I feel strong about the potential we have to make the future beautiful. I promise I won't do this at the start of each episode, but we're wanting to get to our break-even goal with our crowdfund for this podcast before the end of the month. The quicker we get there, the sooner I can stop asking. So if you would like to support us, please head to patreon.com/Amisha and make your pledge today. That's www.patreon.com/AMISHA. We want to keep bringing you these interviews throughout the year and do it advertising free. So as they say, every little helps. You can give something as small as the equivalent of a banana an episode, or sponsor an entire episode, or anything in between. Okay, cringy plea out of the way. For this week, we have my meditation teacher, Sally Kempton, who used to be a Swami before she left the ashram in her late 50s and started to write books and teach around the world. When I first experienced her teachings in a workshop in London a few years ago, they took me into a deep space within myself. I experienced the power of her transmission. As I was diving deep into understanding and teaching the Hindu goddess mythology, Sally in her book, Awakening Shakti, has been a powerful guide because of the grounded way she explains what all this really means. We talk about the divine feminine, cultural appropriation, and finding your spiritual path. She offers ways to learn how to trust yourself and your experiences. I hope that you enjoy this interview, and thank you for listening and for sharing this podcast with your friends and for all the wonderful support you're giving to our team. We're really enjoying making this and that we're creating it together with you. Welcome to The Future is Beautiful, with me, your host, Amisha Gadiali. On this show, we explore the weave between politics, spirituality, creativity, and sustainability. Every one of us has ideas and personal experiences to share that can lead us to a brighter future. Despite the challenges we face as a global community, or the pressures that we meet in our daily lives, when we stop and dare to dream, to ask ourselves the big questions, and to share what we are already doing, we create the future that we wish to wake up for. That future is beautiful. I'm delighted today to be joined by Sally Kempton, who is a writer, teacher, used to be a Swami, and is carrying the Shakti of the goddess in her transmission. Sally, it's really nice to see you.
Very nice to see you.
Nice to be out here in California.
Yes, nice to have you in my living room.
It's very sunny. I guess one of the first things I wanted to talk to you about is the goddess. So there's so much kind of talk now of like being a goddess.
Right.
It's very
right.
It's very new agey and very it's got a look and I think what drew me to your teachings was that it was like the depth of what understanding the different goddesses opened up within myself, and actually that it was so different from this idea of being a goddess. It's actually about being more like real and grounded and present, and knowing ourselves more.
Yeah.
And I would love for you to share for those of our friends listening that have had no introduction to your lineage, what the goddess and the Shakti means.
Okay, big question.
We'll just get right in there.
Okay, so I also was very, let's say, turned off by the trend in the West of beautiful young women identifying themselves as goddesses and it having a particular look. And being very much about adornment, which I'm certainly all for, but without actually looking into really the universality of the sacred feminine energy. So my lineage, my tradition, is a Shaiva lineage, essentially from Western India, from Maharashtra, where my teacher lived. And it's, in other words, it's I was trained in basic fundamental, let's call it masculine yogic spirituality, which is to say that the understanding is that everything is consciousness, that the world is fundamentally illusory, and that the key to awakening yourself is by tuning into awakening the Kundalini energy, the inner Shakti, the inner feminine energy within the body. And in my lineage, which is very much a grace-based, guru-based tradition, the awakening happened through a transmission from the teacher or from, the higher realms. And then the understanding, which has, kind of guided my life for the last 45 years or so, is that once that energy is awakened, then your practice becomes essentially a spontaneous unfolding of an inner intelligent energy, which the understanding is fundamentally feminine, not in a gendered sense, but in the tradition, the feminine is understood to be the dynamic power, the active power within the universe, which is, I would say, one of the radical things about non-dual tantra is the attitude towards power. The understanding that power is on the cosmic level essentially the force of the divine feminine, whereas the nature of the masculine is awareness, is consciousness, and is essentially inactive. So in the tantric lineage that I was trained in, the divine masculine and the divine feminine, or rather the aspects of reality that are at the source of everything, are considered to be still and dynamic, transcendent, immanent, and masculine, feminine, although not in a gendered sense. So the understanding about goddess that my tradition carries is that goddess is the primordial Shakti, the energy which gives rise to life, which exists within everything, within every cell of the body, within every particle of the world, and also is transcendent. So, in many spiritual traditions, the masculine is heaven, the feminine is earth, the masculine is, pure awareness, the feminine is form, the masculine is the brain, the feminine is the body. In non-dual tantra, masculine and feminine are utterly intertwined. So, and goddess as a personal force it arises in the sort of medial space between the transcendent, the formless, the infinitely subtle, and the concrete physical universe. And the understanding in this tradition is that there are many, many layers of reality, many levels of reality, many different kinds of energies that we live in contact with without even necessarily knowing that those energies exist, and that those energies are essentially, let's say, governed by very big, very vast kind of cosmic forces which also have a personal face. And that's, of course, the kind of radical aspect of goddess tradition and, of the Hindu Buddhist traditions, at least the Hindu and Tibetan Buddhist traditions in general, is that there's a complete sense of congruence, as you know, between the recognition that the heart of reality is is formless, is without attributes, is is an indescribable suchness prior to the Big Bang, and perhaps even prior to that. And the understanding that in that process of becoming a physical universe, that transcendent formless energy also takes forms, which we call deities. And that each of these deities, although facets of the one, has a particular energy signature, personal face, which can be accessed on many different levels. It can be accessed within ourselves in meditation, which is the way I have traditionally accessed divine feminine energies, but can also be, once you become aware of the particular quality of goddess energy, you realize that it expresses itself in weather, it expresses itself in landscapes, it expresses itself in culture, it expresses itself in seasons. In other words, that as the traditional cultures understood cosmic forces as being utterly layered at every level of reality. So, for instance, if you're talking about the goddess Kali, who's one of the goddesses that we tend to like to talk about a lot in the modern world.
Dear to my heart.
Yes, dear to your heart and dear to mine. So the goddess Kali, who is a very complex and rich and significant figure in personal mythology and in the mythology of her culture, and now really global culture, I would say. So she has this quality of revolutionary upheaval. As one of the great contemporary lovers of the goddess, not contemporary, modern lovers of the goddess, Aurobindo, said that Kali can accomplish in a moment what would ordinarily take years, so that she really is the goddess of revolution, both inwardly and in the world itself. So you see Kali in wildfires, you see Kali in earthquakes, you see Kali in storms. Many people kind of personalize the climate change events that are going on all over the world as expressions of Kali. And I believe that, in a general sense, they are. And, for example, because we tend to look at cosmic forces through the lens of our early childhood upbringing and see them as rewarding or punishing us, or as protective or destructive, people are often afraid of the violent force that the violent forces of the cosmos, so tend to see Kali as scary, whereas another goddess form, such as Lakshmi in the Indian tradition, or let's say Aphrodite in the Greek tradition, we experience them as in much more benign and loving and erotic ways. So for me, the process of getting to know the personal energy signatures of what, for want of a better word, we call goddess, has really been a process of interior exploration and actually learning how to discern, and this is what I think is important about it, learning how to discern the fact that there is a divine sacred component in human personality, in landscape, in our various expressions that may get twisted or distorted through the human ego, or the way the human ego interacts with the physical world, but which always has this profound sacred energetic component, and that the more we become aware of that, the more we can begin to look at ourselves and our own attempts to make sense of the world as actually being driven by these profound energies that want to express themselves in us and as us. So in the search for authentic identity, for me, and for many of the people, not just women, but also guys I know, to begin to identify the goddess energies in you, and to realize how these energies are operating in your life, and how qualities in yourself that you may have suppressed or repressed or not liked or not felt empowered to express, that once you start to see goddess in them, then you can kind of disambiguate or disentangle the neurotic sort of, let's call them twisted or bent aspects of the way you've interacted with these divine energies, and really let the pure, innocent, direct expression come through you. And I have just found it's a tremendously, we use the word empowering a lot, but it is actually a way of activating your original blueprint, the sacred blueprint that is you, that expresses itself in this human incarnation, but actually has a much deeper energetic quality that you may have not been aware of since early childhood.
Yeah, I've definitely experienced that, especially with Kali, who I avoided because we do.
Because we do, yes.
And then I was in India with a teacher, astrologer of mine, and he just basically sat me down and said, "There's a lot of Kali in you, and you need to go to Varanasi and find it."
Oh, cool.
And so I did.
Yeah.
And as soon as I arrived in Varanasi, I started having these like wild dreams, like floating down the Ganga with Shiva, and like all of this stuff was happening, and this experience in the temple at the Burning Ghats where I was ringing the bell, and just this energy was like, whew. And the experience of embracing that energy rather than trying to push it down, as I had been before, because I was trying to be like nice girl, right? Yeah. And then the amount of authenticity that opened up to be able to live in that power. And I know these words like power can sound a bit like trite or something, but when you feel it, when you connect to that, and you feel your authentic self, but you also feel that there's something behind it that's stronger than you. Yeah. It's just the most beautiful way of moving through life.
Yeah, it gives you an enormous amount of trust, doesn't it? Yeah. So that you can kind of, I mean, the fact that we tend to call the goddess mother, I don't. I've never particularly been drawn to calling goddess mother, but the fact is that support, that power, is really, I would say, the power of mother. That holds us and constantly sends vital force through us, and it does literally empower your personal expression of yourself, your authentic expression. And it's impossible to get it until you experience it. That's the thing. It's like, because it is really all about the awakening of the inner force, the inner power, which the tantric tradition calls kundalini, but which is the interior intelligence that actually wants to remake us such that we can live in alignment with the deepest messages of the cosmos. And ultimately, hopefully, I don't know if save the planet is what she has in mind, but we'd like that.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't necessarily need saving, but
no, it doesn't.
Definitely needs us to be paying attention.
Yes, I would amend that. The planet doesn't need saving, but the human race
does. Totally.
Planet will be okay.
We should be asking the planet to save us.
Yes, well, we do all the time.
Yeah.
I just read a piece in the Times a couple of months ago about the Permian catastrophe, as it's called. You know that it happened something like 260 million years ago, before the dinosaurs, when a bunch of volcanoes kind of erupted on the supercontinent Pangaea, which took up most of the Earth. And they began erupting and sending carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and the entire planet warmed to something like 160 degrees, so that the oceans were, red hot, and all life died. and life died out on the planet for 1 million years, and then gradually life came back, and that was the beginning of the dinosaur period. But I found that so comforting for some reason, even though the timeline is very long, that the planet is going to keep reviving herself, that life cannot be wiped out on this planet.
Mm-hmm. Just us.
Just us, yes. Just us, and exactly.
But we're writing our own history.
We are writing our own history, and we are praying for refuge and grace and some kind of help with the process, because it's not looking that great.
No. How can these practices assist us in our in making sense of the times that we live in, and all of this uncertainty? So even we're in Northern California, and even last night, 2 nights ago, there's a huge fire just down the road from here. It's non-stop,
It's non-stop.
All over the world, and then also reflected in our personal lives as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. How do we use these practices to show up with more power and grace?
Well, yes, and of course that's the question, and I feel that there are several significant ways in which we can use spiritual practice, and other ways in which we must.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the bottom line, of course, for just somebody trying to get through their life, which I think most of us are just trying to cope with what reality throws our way, that having a silent meditation practice that you do for at least half an hour a day is, I feel, utterly necessary, completely necessary. And I think it's the basis, it's the bottom line, it's the thing that we all need to form a habit of, because it is the place that we're going to be able to take refuge in the midst of the extraordinary chaos and all the changes. And the fact that there is clearly a wave going through the planet of profound sociocultural change, climate change. It's like all the cards are up in the air, and we really don't know where they're going to fall. So, and that ability to get quiet and just tune into your own ground and get some peace is, I think, the basis of everything else we do. So, and along with that, I have a very, very strong prayer practice that I realize when push comes to shove, when I just can't figure out what action to take, that tuning inside, getting quiet, and really praying for help with, and for me, cultivating in myself the recognition that I am not capable of affecting change in certain situations. So my contribution to the situation, at least in those moments, is to just pray for help. Mm-hmm. And then to learn to recognize the different forms in which help comes, whether it's through inspiration, whether it's through active, through guidance to action, whether it's through inspiration, whether it's through people coming into your life, whether it's through situations that you are reluctant to engage in, but that you realize you must because there's nobody else to do it. All those, let's say, challenges and opportunities to practice outrageous love, sacred activism, they all rest on your ability to get quiet, because otherwise there's so much that needs to be done in the world, and there's so many situations that are so dire that we tend to get either hysterical or kind of grandiose. So learning to walk humbly in the cusp between what needs to be done and what we are actually capable and qualified to do is a huge thing that every one of us needs to find a way to navigate. Because otherwise we're running around like headless chickens in these different situations that we face, whether professionally or personally. So I could give you a list of practices that I consider significant. One of them is just having the long view of reality, just having what is a fundamentally religious outlook, I must admit, which is that there actually is an awareness that is behind all this and within all this and beneath all this, and that even though we are significantly affecting what goes on in the physical and probably in the subtle universe, ultimately there's a baseline of sacred energy that is in charge, and so at moments of deep despair, it's very helpful to just have a view of, okay, with all this separation and polarization and siloization, nonetheless there is an underlying unity in all of it, and therefore it's all on some level the way it's supposed to be. So, and that's it's a fundamentally religious viewpoint. As a secular lefty, which I am kind of by nature and by upbringing, it's been quite surprising to me that the core of my life has become a kind of a faith in the presence of a higher power. But it definitely is that, I feel the difference between despair, grandiosity, arrogance, and some degree of alignment, humility, connectivity, and the capacity for really getting out-of-the-box inspiration.
Can you share a little bit of your journey from, was it a New York journalist
to the present day?
Yeah.
Sure. So I'm the product of a particular, cultural moment and situation. I'm a second generation writer. My father was a well-known left liberal journalist in New York. I grew up in that world, sort of in the world of university professors and New York literary people, and with a very socialist bent, a very secular, socialist, politically oriented bent. And, in the way that you do, I went to the appropriate college, and then when I got out of college, I was just by pure good fortune. I went to work for an alternative newspaper called The Village Voice, which was at that time at the height of its influence in New York, and had a kind of a career that could have been a lot more successful than it was, except that I just had no real motivation. So, and got married and had various adventures through my 20s. And when I was 27, I had just gotten divorced, and I took my first acid trip with my then boyfriend, and had a complete awakening, as sometimes happens on psychedelic drugs, and saw that everything in the universe was love, that there was nothing other than love. And the effect that this had on me, this was the 1970s. The left had just fallen apart in the aftermath of 1968, which you guys, you're much too young to remember or even have heard of, but it's a little bit like the situation that is happening right now. Only maybe things are more dire now, but it was that feeling of everything that you believed in is is showing itself to not be working, and all of your friends are freaking out, or or becoming, or going underground, or plotting violent actions against the U.S. government. It was a very Kali-esque moment in culture. And so this download of love, this recognition of the ultimate ecstasy of reality, was very, very radical for me. And it lasted about 3 days. And at the end of it, I saw that all of my assumptions were wrong, and that I had to change the way I was approaching life. It took me about 6 months to actually find a way to do spiritual practice, because you sort of couldn't find that in New York.
Really?
Not really.
Wow.
I mean, there were small pockets of spirituality. There were, Tibetan Buddhists were starting to come to the country. There were Americans who had been devotees of gurus like Sai Baba that, had little scenes, but there was the Satchitananda, Shivananda-oriented yoga world. So, and I ended up, this is a longer story than I intended to tell, but I ended up getting involved with a Western teacher who had a spiritual school that was based on the legendary Sufi schools of the Middle East, who gave us a really quite extraordinary integral education into the different components of radical internal transformation, including meditation, including many sort of esoteric practices for sort of dissolving samskaras, lots of yoga, a philosophy, a non-dual philosophical orientation. It was actually a very good orientation, and I just went into it, because, as often happens when you have one of these life-transforming insights, everything about my previous life had begun to seem wrong-headed, deluded. I felt that I'd been just driven by egoic wants and desires, and that I had to become a different kind of person. So, and after about I think I'd been doing that practice for about 1.5 years and I had a kind of secondary awakening, and in which an enormous amount of energy seemed to come in through the crown of my head and fill my body with light, and freaked me out. I mean, it was just way more energy than I could ever imagine fielding. And in those days, very little was known about Kundalini Shakti, and most of what was known was wrong, and scary. So I immediately thought, oh, I've had some kind of wrong style Kundalini awakening, and now I'm in terrible trouble. But in that experience, I heard from inside the name of the man who eventually became my teacher, Swami Muktananda, who I had a kind of a connection with because friends of mine had been to see him. And somehow the conviction that he could guide me, that I needed a teacher, and that he was the teacher, and that just came as a little insight. 6 months went by. He came to Los Angeles, where I lived. I went to meet him and ended up traveling with him and editing his books, and eventually being given initiation as a Swami in his organization. He died 8 years later, and I stayed. And most of my training, both as a teacher and as a scholar, if you call me that, of texts, just came about in that context, which is a unique kind of context. It's very much what's called the Gurukula tradition, where you study in the house of your guru, you study spiritual texts, and your orientation is not so much information or academic academic understanding, but how does this teaching help my spiritual unfoldment? So then in about 2002, I just started to feel that I was living such a hermetic life that I was not being useful to people, that the world was, that you just cannot authentically teach spirituality to householders without being one yourself. So I left that situation and began living in California and writing for Yoga Journal and other publications, and writing books and teaching workshops, and basically applying the non-dual teachings of yoga, especially Kashmir Shaiva Tantra, to people's regular lives. And that's my story. And my own journey, of course, which unfolds within that.
I want to go back to like the beginning bit with the acid trip.
Sure.
Because were you at all tempted to just take more acid and see what happened? What
and
led
I
you
did.
to practices, to choosing practices as a way?
Well, the thing about acid, as you know, and all psychoactive drugs, is that the effects don't last. A. B, they're hard on your body.
Yeah.
And somehow, again, I have friends now who are very much on medicine journeys, who do their spiritual practice with the aid of especially plant medicine, and that's their path. And it's not that I believe it is an authentic path. It's not the path I took. But I just somehow knew that authentic transformation and authentic awakening has to be something that you don't need anything else to activate. That, in other words, that it really is between you and you and your soul, and the lineage, the subtle lineage connection. God, if you will, goddess, if you will. So I was always very much about, at the very least, human intermediaries rather than substance intermediaries. So I just, the guidance, as it were, because, though this isn't a word I use a lot, but once you start awakening in this way, you then learn to follow the signals that you get from inside or from the world around you. And though I don't consider myself a great follower of signals, what I realized in retrospect was that the paths that I took were the paths that showed up for me at crucial times. And that's just the way I find to be an authentic way of traveling this path, is you see what shows up, and you see how it feels, and you experiment, and if it doesn't turn out well, then you're free to make another choice. But essentially, it's a path of action. It's a path of learning what authentic signals are for yourself as you move through life. And so I was not guided to. I did take psychedelics for the first couple of years. I was involved. The spiritual group I was involved with used a lot of psychedelics. But what happens with psychedelics, at least with acid, and I haven't done it for a long time, but what I noticed, it was always the first experience was utterly revelatory. After that, you would sort of check off, okay, here come the hallucinations, okay, here comes the now I'm in the moment, here comes the crash. In other words, it's a chemical intervention. It works really on a completely physical level, even though it obviously opens up brain centers. But at a certain point, your nervous system, speaking for myself, becomes habituated to the way that psychoactive drug works. and it's not surprising. In other words, it's no longer revelatory, it's mechanical. And fun, pleasant, sometimes extraordinary. I think the plant medicines, ayahuasca, mushrooms, peyote, etc., are more, they're more organic, and therefore often open up unexpected pathways that the man-made chemicals do not. And I say this with, I think acid is fabulous, and I think everyone should take it at least once or twice. But mainly because it shows you the possibilities.
I guess it gives you a very, just a very clear something to compare everything to, a completely different reference point to everything that you know. And and it also, this is a whole conversation about neurohacking and what, how much the brain has to do with your spiritual unfoldment. Certainly, if you're using chemicals, it becomes pretty clear very quickly that most of what's going on that feels extraordinary and transformative is happening in the brain. There's, and I'm so happy that research is now being done such that we are finding out more and more about how psychedelic interventions work psychologically as well as spiritually. But even if you're on that path, the grounding of having a daily meditation practice is so vital for the integration process.
I think it's vital not only for the integration process. Again, one of my closest associates, a member of my family actually, is doing a very serious daime path, which is the Brazilian sort of religious approach to ayahuasca and chatroon, and it's a very, very rich, and intense path. They do a lot of chanting, and they do a lot of disciplined practice. So it's different than what I understand the way people do ayahuasca and peyote. It's much more focused and rigorous. And he's extremely, I think his blood is pickled in that substance at this point. I think it's, he's a purely receptacle for the daime, which is what they call it. And he's someone I trust and respect. He's done 30 years of traditional spiritual practice, so he's not naive. So there's a lot I don't know about psychoactive substances, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I didn't mean to take us so much on it, on a psychoactive tangent, but I guess it's become so prevalent in the spiritual world right now that it's, and sometimes I feel like it is often like a kind of quick fix.
I think so
rather
too.
than doing the work, the showing up every day and going deep into ourselves in that way.
Yeah, and I also find, and again, it can be profoundly ungrounding, and certainly has been for me on some occasions. So, you really do. There's no substitute for really getting to know your own body-mind, and as you only get to know your body-mind by the inner work that you do, whether it's meditative, whether it's dietary, whether it's the way you use your body. You really do need to find out what makes you vata out so that you can't actually experience your body, what makes you heavy. So much of the traditional teachings, like the teachings about the gunas, the traditions about the doshas, the traditions about the different types of mind, are so helpful in understanding how to calibrate your own spiritual journey, because very few of us these days are inside traditional spiritual paths. Most of us are either post-traditional or in peer traditions in which basically nobody knows anything. So
what's a peer tradition?
Well, a peer tradition would be, let's say, if you and I and 4 of our friends got together and created a practice, taking a little bit from a Celtic tradition, a little bit from a Hindu tradition, and maybe some mindfulness practice and some psychedelics, and we sort of put it all.
Basically, what all my teachers do.
Basically, yeah. Basically, what most of the people I know, under 40 in the spiritual world are doing, and God bless you. But it's, it's what I did it's what we do when we're starting our journey, is we experiment with what shows up. But at a certain point, you just need a rigorous discipline. Otherwise, well, several things. First of all, and this is my issue with psychoactive drugs, for better or worse, psychoactive drugs put us in touch with the subtle forces of the universe, most of which are unfamiliar to us as humans. We're not that sophisticated in dealing with subtle energies. Some of those subtle energies are very benign. Some of them are mischievous, and mostly we don't know the difference. So when you're taking a psychedelic substance and your consciousness gets opened, and the effects can be, extremely scary if you're not grounded, if you're not experienced, or extremely delusive. So there's a lot that can go on in your inner world as a result of opening your consciousness. And the thing that I think protects you, other than a really responsible guide, which hopefully one has at every phase, but also a discipline, an inner discipline, and a self-awareness, so that you know when you recognize yourself under delusion, you recognize yourself in fear, you recognize yourself when you're getting, oh my God, I've seen the cosmos. You see through your rackets enough to be able to go through altered states without losing yourself in the narrative, in the story, in the movie.
So you come to a place where you can observe yourself in that observation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Which is hard.
Well, which takes practice, and a kind of rigorous practice.
Yeah.
So, and I just think at some point we have to commit ourselves to some rigor.
Yeah, I guess it's part of the culture that we're in. It's so rare to find anyone that is in one lineage of any kind of teaching.
Yeah.
But I suppose that's why meditation is such a great base to have, because although there are so many different kinds of meditation, at least we can have the discipline of sitting with ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And even if the most simple meditation, sitting and being with the breath and returning to the breath, is going to ground you, it's because consciousness will tend to interiorize if you give it a path to interiorize on. And the breath is such a path, or mantra is such a path. And I find that the simpler the better for actually cultivating the neural pathways that let you turn into your core. And then once you know how to do that, then you can play with energies and meditations and consider different traditional approaches, because you are in contact with your own heart, with your own belly, with your own sushumna nadi. and that's your bottom line.
And so what, like, if someone has never meditated before, and all of this is new to them, you know, you have taught many people now to meditate through your book, but through your teachings, and I imagine you've had conversations with people when they just begin or when they've established a practice. What is the difference between how a person who meditates functions compared to how a person that doesn't functions? Like, is there a kind of clear difference?
Well, of course, we all have different characters, and we
Yeah.
all have different karmic patterns. I would say, in general, a person who meditates usually has a fairly well-established witness or observing ego, as like, you know, as they say in the psychiatric world, that is a capacity to stand aside from their own emotional upheavals and actually make decisions about how to deal with their own emotions, how to deal with other people in their encounters, and that the development of that observing witness, I think, especially when your witness, your witness capacity is connected to your heart, to your emotional body, so that there's rasa in it, so that there's affection in it, so there's tenderness in it. That once you've established that, which is, I think, you know, the main thing that meditation is supposed to do for people who are not going to go into a cave and become pure contemplatives, it just changes the whole platform of your life. I mean, an example, just a personal example. I have a historical wounded, piece from when I was 5, when my best girlfriend, when I was 5 or 6, when she betrayed me. And so there's a big sort of swamp, as we all have, on that issue of girlfriends, not loving me. And one of my female friends did something that triggered that swamp, and I, because I have cultivated the tendency to go into the observer and look at the situation, as I noticed the emotions coming up, mostly anger, I was able to work with it, to sort of step back and do all the various interventions that we know to do, such as saying, well, was what she did really intended to hurt me? What kind of state is she in? What are the stresses on her? And after all, we've had many years of a wonderful relationship, and I'm not 5 and she's not 5, and to kind of work with my mind, and then until I could drop into my heart and just say, I got triggered, and yes, I could, ask her not to say stuff like that, but the truth is, she didn't mean it. So, and that's a very, very simple, ordinary life experience, that that the habit of self-observation and self-questioning makes possible, that I do think meditation is crucial for it. At least it has been for me.
Yeah, and I guess that kind of goes into the difference between, nowadays everyone's like, okay, you need to meditate so you'll be more productive, and you'll be, to kind of this sort of, you can be more superhuman, and then you won't be stressed, and then you'll be able to send 50 times more emails per hour, and all of this stuff around meditation as a tool.
Yes.
But,
the Silicon Valley neurohacking, mind hacking approach to life. Yes.
Yeah. Well, it's catching on everywhere.
Yeah, I know.
But there's a huge difference between meditating with that intention and a kind of a different kind of meditation, which is to really know yourself.
Yeah. Well, and also to actually discover within yourself the infinite potential of the human, of the divine human.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the whole idea of the divine human, first of all, there's the Western Promethean viewpoint about the divine human, you know, that which is, I think, the Silicon Valley viewpoint. So we collect these tools and we make ourselves superhuman, and then we go out and we conquer the world. You know, we become rich, we create innovative programs, et cetera, and which is all fine. I mean, it's a life stage. It's a life stage thing. You know, when you're a young person, you need to make a mark in the world. That's part of what we're meant to do in our 20s and 30s and 40s. So, and it's one of the reasons I think why Jung said that the deep process of integration and self-knowing, in his day, he believed that it was something that we do in middle age. That, you know, that we need to discover the greatness of our capacities, and we also need to discover our limits.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in order to be willing to look deeper. So my, you know, as a teacher, my belief is that until you're about 50, until you're about 30, you're working out your childhood karmas. You're dealing with your parental issues. You're not even really a fully formed person.
Mm-hmm.
Around 30, you start to realize, how your character might use some interventions, and you begin to know what your skills are, you know, and what your limits are. And then those years between, at least for me and for most of the people that I know, between say 28 and 50 are the time when you make your world. You know, you make a family. You fulfill your profession, and around 50 there's a natural recognition of what is the unfinished business. What have I had to sacrifice of my own authenticity in order to make make a life, and you start to want to take back the things that you've left behind or lost or considered unimportant, and that, I believe, is when deep spiritual practice happens. And it doesn't mean that you don't have a strong spiritual practice, and as people do younger and younger now, you know. But I think we can give ourselves a discount as to how we see our practice until the moment comes when the longing to really know the depths of ourselves arises, and it's a natural process. Again, speaking for myself, it happens naturally at a certain point, at different points in your life, obviously, that
Mm-hmm.
we have different levels of awakening.
And we're not all on the same timeline.
And we're not all on the same timeline. And I mean, I've had a completely backwards life.
Mm-hmm.
I went into an ashram in my 20s, my late 20s. I came, my whole career, the so-called career I have now, it all happened in that context. And then I came out and had to make a life in the world, meaning learn how to make money, learn how to have a house, learn how to, I sort of learned everything that you're supposed to learn in your 20s and 30s in my 60s.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm a complete, so what I always tell people is that you'll have a second act, you'll have a third act, you'll have a fourth act, so let yourself follow the path you're on. Don't do anything to damage your body and mind, or try not to damage your body and mind so that they're intact for the inevitable third act.
Mm-hmm.
And fourth act.
Which act are you on?
I'd say I'm ending the third and starting on the fourth. I feel the way I felt in my 20s before I started the spiritual path, and the way I felt in my 50s before I left the ashram. It feels like something completely new is starting to happen. And I'm in the in the space between, in the madhya, in the place between full commitment to what I was doing as a teacher and writer and what the next thing is. So, so it's interesting.
It's the next thing. It's opening up. Don't know what it is yet.
The next thing is I'm starting to get a sense of what it is, but it's not quite. It's not entirely clear.
How much do you feel that the practices that you have been doing have contributed to you being in this stage of life and having so much energy? I mean, we were doing a training recently and you're like running around with the microphone, like laughing and, you know, just like full energy, long days. Like, I was watching.
Well, you guys were like,
you have exactly. It's like, how is she doing that? I want a nap.
Honestly, it's completely the Shakti.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, honestly, it's like, I mean, the truth is, I have almost no physical energy. I'm a complete creature of the Shakti. That she just makes decisions that she wants to do a teacher training at Try Yoga in London, and I show up and she does it. I mean, that's the truth. So yes, it's entirely to do with my practices.
Mm-hmm.
It's entirely to do with the unfolding Kundalini and acting through this body-mind with this particular karma, as she acts through your body-mind with your particular karma. But it really is, it's her deal. So, that's my experience.
Mm-hmm. I just wanted to speak about men for a moment, because in, you know, so many of the trainings that I do, or in the classes that I teach, or that all of my contemporaries teach, it's mostly women. Yeah. And so when we talk about this language of, you know, her like moving through us, I've not met any men that feel that same connection to the Shakti. And obviously they exist, and obviously all the men listening can tune into this and feel that connection. And so I just wanted you to share a bit about that, maybe some of the men that you have met or taught, and that it...
Yeah, so, well, I come out of a male-dominated tradition, which was also a very strongly Shakti-driven tradition. Mm-hmm. So my original experience was with my teacher and the guys I knew in that lineage. They had a different relationship to Shakti than women do, and it's something I've thought about a lot, because my initial experience with Shakti and men is that, just as, I'm going to anthropomorphize this, but just as mothers love their sons, you know, and mothers have different expectations of their daughters, you know, Shakti loves, I'm actually feeling emotional about this, because there's something very beautiful about it. Shakti loves the masculine. You know, Shakti has chosen over these millennia to enact creatively through male bodies. And that's changing. I mean, it's never been absolute, but what we call patriarchy, I would say, is really a decision of goddess to act through male bodies and be hidden, you know, to be behind the curtain, as they used to say in Indian courts. And that, whereas so many of the men that I've known who are deep practitioners and who are in touch with their inner Shakti, which usually means they're in touch with the awakened and rising Kundalini, they use words, when they talk about goddess, they use words like inner girlfriend or mother. In other words, they relate to her, you know, in an anthropomorphic way. As I mean, I was giving a workshop with Sienna actually at a yoga studio in Portland about 5 years ago, and as usual, there were mostly women in the room. There were about 6 guys, and one of them was a studio owner who had clearly come to be a good host. And he said that when I started talking about goddess, because that was the focus of the workshop, it was actually the weekend that Awakening Shakti came out, he said, oh, this is going to be one of those feminist things, and I'm not going to be able to stand it. And we did this meditation on the goddess Lalita as the rising Kundalini. And he began to experience this energy, this ecstatic energy rising within his body, making love to him from inside, which is one of the characteristics of that particular aspect of the divine feminine. And he said it was the most extraordinary experience, one of the most extraordinary experiences he'd ever had, and made him understand who Goddess is to him, how utterly intimate his relationship with Goddess is, and how unknown it is, you know, because the truth is Goddess is your energy, Goddess is your vital force, Goddess is your inspiration, and I think the way Goddess and Shakti are mostly taught is woman-oriented. You know, I mean, there is a lot of connection between the way people talk about Shakti and female sexuality. There's a tendency to associate Shakti with sexual energy, and she's so much more than that. And she's so. I mean, she manifests, I think, differently in men than in women. But I think the difference is not anatomical, but more about acculturation. You know, and so most of the men that I know and most of the men who study with me tend to be hyper-rational and have come to study with me because they want to open their hearts. So it's a particular aspect of the population. And so discovering the divine feminine for those guys is really, generally speaking, about discovering their own heart. So, and one of my female friends and I used to ask ourselves, well, where are all the men in our world? And the men are going to Buddhist teachers. They're going to Ken Wilber. They're going to, and again, this is a vast generalization. They're going to more intellectually based, more consciousness based, more scientifically based traditions, whereas women in general tend to be drawn to more feeling based, more body based, and I don't quite know why that is, but I think it just has to do with the way we're acculturated. I don't think it's endemic. But it's not helpful. The I'm a goddess wearing my flowing blue robes with my long wavy hair is not very helpful.
You've got long wavy hair.
You've got very lovely long wavy hair.
Flea dress on today.
Yes. Exactly. It's not that helpful to allowing people in male bodies to get the all-pervasiveness of Goddess.
Yeah.
And so, but on the other hand, you know, there's something about a purely woman's practice that it creates a safe space for women that is profound.
Which in one way, you know, a lot of the fact that Western yoga is so female dominated.
Yeah.
Meant that I went from being someone that spent a lot of my time with men, like as I preferred hanging out with the guys from some of those earlier childhood mis-experiences with women, with the girls. And then because of diving deep into these practices with, you know, big groups of women, it offered such a safe space for just completely shifting my whole relationship with the feminine in every level.
Yeah, it's really true.
Yeah.
It's really true.
But
Yeah.
it's nice when the guys come too.
It's really nice when the guys come to it. Someone from that training wrote to me saying that she, because I think there were 4 men in that training, and most of them were not that forthcoming, and they weren't speaking up so much in class. And she told me that she was in a dyad with one of the guys who'd been very quiet, and he was saying how scary it was for him to be in a room full of women, and how he had to actually overcome this feeling of it not being okay in order to participate. So that it's interesting. I mean, I'm just thinking of a panel I was on at the Science and Non-Duality Conference in San Jose a few years ago with 3 other women teachers. And there were a lot of guys in the room. And the conversation was, it was sort of a scattered conversation, but at some point a guy raises his hand and says, "I feel left out of this whole conversation," and everyone began to take care of him, it's okay. And I realized that, of course, it's been the other way around for hundreds and hundreds of years, that a woman walking into a spiritual scene, which was mostly male-dominated, would feel left out, different, not fully welcomed. And it's part of, I think, the rise of the feminine in modern culture, that women are kind of giving ourselves permission to dominate a space, and that I have complete faith that we are going to bring these together. That you sort of have to go off by yourself before you come back and integrate with the rest of society. And I think it's the same with gender right now. I mean, the upheavals in gender relationships this month are just outrageous. So, yeah.
And also, as more women are coming together in these yoga ways,
right?
More and more men's retreats, men's groups, men's practices for men to kind of go deeper into their sensitivity and their emotional space in a safe space together is also arising. And then you think, okay, well, that's going to be so exciting when you bring those two together.
Yeah. Yeah. And hopefully not getting, I mean, on the interpersonal level, there's so much work to do.
Yeah.
I mean, with our own femininity, with our own masculinity, with male-female conversations, and those conversations have been going on, certainly in this country, for 30 or 40 years, but they've all stayed on the psychological, the psychosocial, social. And I do think we're now beginning to have the possibility of a truly integrated gender conversation, that's intersectional, but that it also includes the spiritual component. And because somehow we are being asked to live responsibly in the psychosocial, racial, political universe, as with what you're doing, without leaving out the spiritual, and without using the spiritual to bypass, the obligations and challenges of the other realms.
It's like one small big thing that I wanted to just touch on before we close, which is, I guess, the boundaries around being attracted to this practice. So we kind of talked about how for men, because it's so goddess oriented, that could be off-putting, but then also because it comes from an Indian Hindu tradition.
Right.
And
right.
I wondered what your feelings were on that whole kind of conversation around whether it's culturally appropriate for people that are drawn to these practices that have no lineage, at least in this lifetime, of connection to those practices, or if it really is like what speaks to your heart, and are we moving into a time where where there's a reason that all the practices are like all over the world.
I mean, what's interesting is that, you know, the backlash on global capitalism, which I think we're in the middle of. You know, we moved through celebrating globalism, and now we're going, wait a minute. And I think the same thing is true about global spirituality. You know, I mean, it's obvious that the jewels of the traditions are being scattered around the world, and you can pluck a tantric practice and a Buddhist practice and put them together in your own way without ever recognizing the rigor of the tradition, without having a real teacher, and I don't think that's a good thing.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know. I cannot imagine trying to navigate this territory without having put myself into the container of a traditional guru. But on the other hand, trustworthy traditional gurus are very hard to come across. And so this is the situation. So I mean that cultural appropriation panel that we did in London with in which the issue of Sanskrit pronunciation, which is something that I feel very challenged on because my Sanskrit pronunciation is so terrible. The idea that if you don't understand, if you can't pronounce the words correctly, you're cut off from the power, which I think is let's call it the spiritual nationalism of a tradition. Mm-hmm. You know, you're a Buddhist if you've been through the Buddhist process. You're a Hindu if you've been through the Hindu process. And I think that's very much like the immigration conversations that are going on in Europe now, you know, and the Hindutva conversations that are going on in India now, and the Rohingya are not Burmese conversations that are going on in Myanmar now. You know, that it's part of the global backlash. What the hell are these people doing coming into our culture and taking what they like, and you know, and not being willing to go through the assimilation process that, you know, that allows everyone to be on the same cultural page and understand each other's language. I mean, it's a wild, chaotic situation now.
But in a sense, we're all in a wilderness now, because we are. Everything is so, like, because nobody comes from a place where they know everyone, where they've known everyone for generations, and there's a certain kind of practice and tradition. Everyone, no matter where you are, there's been so much movement of people and ideas.
I think the question of what are the criteria, what are the adhikara, what is our entitlement to speak for a tradition that's not our birth tradition. Mm-hmm. How do we become entitled to speak for a tradition that's not our birth tradition? Mm-hmm. At what point are we able to speak authentically? And I think that, I mean, for me, because I was deeply trained in a tradition in which it was required that you speak the language and use the texts and have the worldview of that tradition, which was very different than the one I had grown up in. And I think this is part of for the training for one who comes from a particular culture and takes on the cultural and takes on a spiritual path that comes from a different culture, that there's something about the unfamiliarity of that culture which frees you from the trappings, because we often just can't see our own tradition. It's too dead for us. And plus, orthodoxy in all religions is like, here are the rules. Do it like this. If you don't, you'll go to hell or whatever. And why would we want to adopt a religion that tells us that? So somehow we come in from a skewed place and then realize, oh, this was in my heart all along.
Well, and that's it. Whatever it is, whatever the language, the names, it's just something that's in all of our hearts.
Yeah. Yeah. One of my friends who's Puerto Rican and who was brought up Catholic, who had an awakening through his Indian guru, went to the church in his town in Puerto Rico, and as the priest was giving the host in the communion wafer, he saw a light coming through the window of the church and coming into the wafer, and he saw that there actually is a transmission of Shakti that goes on through that ritual. And he saw the whole lineage of Jesus that moves through the Catholic Church. That's quite unique and specific and genuine. And I think that's part of what happens as we have an inner awakening, is that we start to see what's at the heart of religious, the empowerment that's at the heart of ritual.
And then that takes the divisiveness away from a different way of practice, a different way of being, a different religious view, because underneath it you can feel what's the same.
And to hold the paradox of the specific, the particular, the unique. That's every tradition. Every tradition is unique and particular and specific, and the universal thing within all of them. To be able to hold those two together, I feel that's where we're going. We don't just want to. One of my friends says that interfaith dialogue is, Christians who don't believe in Christianity, Hindus who don't believe in Hinduism, they get together and find out they have a lot in common. But this is the finding the depths in the different traditions. And for me, what's been really interesting is discovering what it is that each tradition does better than anybody else. That Hinduism, for instance, I feel holds the simultaneity of the non-dual and and polytheism. That it's that incredibly sophisticated recognition that everything is this comes out of this formless, apparent nothingness, and there are deities that you can have a personal relationship with. Hinduism knows that both are true, which many other traditions don't get. Like the Buddhists don't really get that. And Christianity is deep Christianity is really good at love, and really good at grace. Whereas Judaism is extraordinarily good at ethics. And so every tradition has its brilliance, that the thing they do better than anybody else. And how beautiful if we can get to a place where we can take the spirit of bodhicitta from the Buddhists, and the spirit of loving forgiveness from the Christians, and the amazing capacity for integrating karma, bhakti, jnana, and yoga that is characteristic of Hinduism. That we have all this available to us.
We're limitless.
We're limitless, yeah. Yes.
Well, that's a perfect place
to end.
To end. To bring a limit to the limitlessness.
Yes.
Thank you, Sally.
Oh, my pleasure. My
so
pleasure.
Wonderful to sit with you and and to share in this way. And I just want to recommend to everyone to read Sally's books, Awakening Shakti. My copy is probably the most worn book I have. It travels around the world with me. And Meditation for the Love of It. And your website, sallykempton.com.
Yes, and I do teleclasses, so I'm actually doing a teleclass starting in January on a Kashmir Shaiva text called The Heart of the Doctrine of Recognition, in which we will attempt to make it really practical, see how we can make non-dual awareness really applicable.
Beautiful. Well, I imagine I'll be on that course in January, and hope to see some of you there that are listening. Thank you, Sally.
Thank you so much for everything you're doing and for who you are. It's beautiful to be with you and to see the unfolding of you.
Thank you for listening. As always, you can find links to everything we mentioned in this episode, download our book, and discover so much more over on the blog. We don't believe in selling you things you don't need through this podcast, and so it's made possible by you, our community. If you loved this and would like to contribute to our Patreon campaign or join our online group to connect with other listeners, please visit www.thefutureisbeautiful.co and click on community. Please also hit subscribe and leave us a review on iTunes so we can grow. Here is to us, creating a beautiful future together.